Chasing the Mind, Podcast Episode 3, The Secret Life of Wonder Woman, with Brad Sultan. Welcome to Chasing the Mind, hosted by Dr. Angela Johnson and Dr. Stephanie Schwartz, the podcast that explores the art and science of the mind. Each episode, we will feature a topic or guest who offers a unique perspective in answering the following questions. How do our thoughts influence our sense of who we are? How do we impact the world around us? And can changing our minds change everything? Today on Chasing the Mind, Dr. Angela and Dr. Stephanie will be speaking with Brad Sultan, comic book enthusiast.
Brad Sultan is a lawyer, but his passion is history, comic books, silent movies, 1920s jazz, trains, astronomy, and he's an expert on 1970s game shows. He straddles the line between eclectic and just plain weird. A former journalist, legislative aide, and anti-tobacco advocate, Brad's mind often wanders, but he rarely chases after it. He loves travel, especially to London. Brad was glad to learn that podcasts, unlike television, do not add 10 pounds to your appearance. We'd like to welcome Brad tonight to Chasing the Mind, where we're going to talk about
Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman.
Well, thank you, doctors.
Hi, we are excited to have you, Brad.
I'm excited to be had. So Wonder Woman was created in 1941 by Dr. William Moulton Marsten, who was a Harvard-educated psychologist and quite the weirdo. He was one of the early inventors of the lie detector, an early version of the polygraph. He was also strongly into bondage, and he was strongly into polygamy, having 2 wives.
Is the correct term polyamorous at this point?
I don't know. You're the psychologist.
Well, he wasn't married to both, so I think it would be polyamory.
He liked women.
He did like women, yes.
But he
lot.
also, Wonder Woman was really the first female superhero. And at the time, the superheroes were really popular at the beginning of World War II, and she was the first woman. He believed that women were better than men, that women should rule the world because then there wouldn't be any war, and that women were stronger than men. But at the same time, he got really turned on by bondage and by having 2 women in his life. Wonder Woman was popular from the very beginning when she first started. But even then, to show you what the times were like, she was tied up in every single issue of her comic book, at least once, maybe twice, sometimes by women, sometimes by men. What's interesting is she was asked to join the Justice Society of America, which was the first superhero group, a way, way, way back precursor of X-Men and Justice League, but she was not a full member. She was their secretary.
Oh, I remember that. That was rather sexist.
Of course, it was the times, and probably I don't think that came from Marston. I think it came from probably his bosses, because girls were not believed to be reading comic books. It was just boys.
Well, let's step back just a minute. So, Dr. Marsten was a Harvard-educated psychologist who at first created this, what he determined to be a lie detector.
Well, it was somewhere along the line, but he was also kind of a kook.
Well, I was going to say he wasn't very respected by his colleagues. He struggled in his career early on.
Yes.
He married and then was somewhat challenged in trying to support his family.
Right.
And then wasn't it true that actually someone else came along and said that they had created the lie detector, so even that wasn't credited to him at the time?
Yeah, his problem was that he said a lot of he would build himself up. He would say things that weren't true. He would come up with wacky ideas, like about women ruling the world. His common law wife was the niece of Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood,
Which fits in with sort of the feminist kind of icon that Wonder Woman is.
Well, and the thing is, even though he was huge into bondage and all that, From everything I've read, he truly believed that women were better than men, even if he objectified them. I mean, Wonder Woman was more powerful than any man, and she was also, her best friends were a bunch of college girls named the Holiday Girls, including Etta Candy, who was a short little woman that was her best friend, and she was kind of a dope. But the Holiday Girls would often help her fight crime. And she spent a lot of time with women in togas.
Well, this sort of goes back to where Wonder Woman was supposed to have come from, right?
Right.
This all-female society.
Right, which Marston thought would be a better world. So it's kind of strange because on one hand, he really did admire and believe in women, but on the other hand, it was clearly sexual because Wonder Woman was always being tied up. And when you look back at the old stories, it's really kind of bizarre because she's always being tied up in every single issue. And in fact, the publisher, what was the precursor to DC Comics, after a couple of years, Wonder Woman was really successful. And they did a lot of surveys, and all the boys loved her and loved her adventures, even though they were kind of crudely drawn, even for the time. The publisher of All American Comics, in speaking with, they had an advisory board. DC Comics at the time had an advisory board of psychologists and educators who supposedly read everything to give them advice on how to make things more wholesome. One of them had talked to the publisher and said, does she really have to get tied up in chains every single issue?
Wasn't there also an issue about her costuming?
Surprisingly, no. Her costume now is different because it's more of a warrior. But her costume was basically the same. On the cover of the first issue of Wonder Woman, she was wearing a skirt. And it's the only time she did. After that, she was always wearing shorts with stars on them. The costume that Wonder Woman wore in the TV show, Linda Carter, was pretty much identical to what Wonder Woman wore in 1941. The artist who drew her for 15 years was a really weird artist. And his drawing was not at all realistic. It's very stylized. So I don't remember reading anything about that. But a lot of people resented Wonder Woman back then because women were not in charge and women were not smarter or more powerful, and they were still seen as weak. Even during the war, when Rosie the Riveter and women went into defense plants, they were still the little lady. But things really got bad after the war when the men came back and the women sort of went back to baking pies and taking care of the kids.
Well, hopefully, but I think some women that needed those jobs were forced out.
Most of the women who needed those jobs were forced out because after the war, almost no women worked in fields like that. They were secretaries, and they were nurses and teachers. But they didn't work in defense plants, and they didn't drive cabs, and they didn't drive garbage trucks like during the war when women could do anything.
Right.
But the problem with Wonder Woman after that is that she was seen as threatening to the male hierarchy, I guess you'd call it, because she was more powerful than any man. Steve Trevor was her boyfriend pretty much from day one, and he was always sort of a wimp. He would rescue her occasionally, but more often than not, she was rescuing him, which a lot of people found very offensive because he was kind of a wuss.
So what kinds of places would people have these discussions about being upset at what Wonder Woman was doing?
I suspect it was mostly psychologists. Comic books started becoming suspect after the war in the late 40s. Later on, it was anger and people were upset about horror comics and crime comics, which were very violent and gory, even by today's standards. But even before that, people started talking against comic books because they were seen as harmful to children.
But there's one thing I wanted to pick up on, because you were talking about Wonder Woman being tied up in every episode and Marsden's interest in bondage. And you tied it to sexuality. And I do know some people who are interested in BDSM or the kink community who object to the sort of the idea that all kink is inherently sexual.
I don't think when this was going on in the 40s that there were really that many kink communities.
But why was there I guess the point is more toward The objection to her being tied up all the time was obviously because it was seen as being something sexual.
I mean, 'cause she certainly wasn't always tied up in sexual situations.
No. But the point is, it was generally against her will. Don't forget, back in the 40s, you did not see things like that. It was not acceptable. Women in ads were wearing dresses and gloves and hats, and women were not tied up or bound or things like that. And when you look at the stuff now, a lot of it's really kinky. And I think at the time, no kid would have known that. Maybe their fathers did, or their mothers did. But it just was kind of odd for the time.
It's interesting because on one hand, people are objecting because she's too powerful. And on the other hand, they're objecting because she's being tied up against her will. It's sort of, they're objecting from both sides.
I think a lot of it was just a lot of men were threatened by Wonder Woman. But there's a panel in a comic book from 1942 where I don't know if it's a dream sequence or a nightmare, but she's married to Steve Trevor, and there's a panel where she's sitting in a chair and he's tying a chain to her leg, and he says, "Yes, I'm going to chain you like this every time I go out." And she says, "How thrilling! See, you're chaining me to the cook stove. What a perfect caveman idea." And that was even in the 60s. I think there was this belief that women wanted a caveman. They wanted a husband to tell them what to do, and they wanted a husband to boss them around. And that was the traditional role of women in the 40s. So seeing Wonder Woman like that, or Diana Prince, her alter ego, that was probably acceptable. Especially during the war, men would want to see a woman chained to the stove, because that was a woman's role. Well, I guess the thing with Marston is people didn't know necessarily about his proclivities for bondage, because it wasn't something you discussed, and he died very young in 1947 or 48. And this isn't something you could talk about until probably the 70s. So I think a lot of people for a long time didn't know that about him. And Jill Lepore's book that came out a few years ago, she had access to his letters and his wife and his girlfriend's letters and the children's letters. And it wasn't until then that people really realized just how odd he was. And that he was into that stuff and open about it back when you couldn't say the word sex in a movie. And damn was a horrible curse word that they almost cut out of Gone with the Wind. Even in the early 40s, he got letters, Marston, from soldiers saying, "I don't know about you, but I love the bondage in Wonder Woman comics because it turns me on."
Oh, interesting.
People had the same proclivities then as they do now.
Well, and we also don't know which women may have liked it and been into it. I know that with the two wives that he had, the wife that he actually married did end up in a long-term relationship with his sort of second partner, but she wasn't really given a choice about having the second woman in the relationship either. It was sort of like, this second woman is coming into our relationship, accept it or take a hike.
Right, and eventually they became very close and stayed together after he died and raised a family, and I have no idea what their relationship was, other than they were probably very good friends. They obviously both agreed to the situation. He must have been very charismatic. But he had written, even in the 20s, about erotic bondage and domination of men by women and things like that. The bigger problem came, as I started to say, about in the late 40s, when people started looking at comic books as a negative thing. And it got much worse later in the 50s, but even in the 40s, there was talk that, what the hell's wrong with Wonder Woman? And there were people saying, she's a lesbian.
Really? At the time?
She hangs out with all these...
Well, she was from a whole nation of women.
That's
so
true.
Of course.
Well, and her favorite exclamation was suffering Sappho. And Marston knew exactly what these things meant, and he wrote them up till he died. But it's the first time that ever became a concern. There were psychologists writing about this in popular magazines, about what a horrible influence this was on little boys because they're lesbians, and little girls would see that and become lesbians too. How horrible. And that went along with how can you have a woman who's more powerful than men? How can you have this woman who doesn't need a man? She supposedly has Steve Trevor for a boyfriend, but she rescued him pretty much every story they were ever in.
Well, that goes back to, were comic books originally written for children?
Yes, they were. There was a belief that no adult would ever read a comic book. And Frederick Wortham, who was a famous psychiatrist who pioneered psychiatry for poor inner city children, he opened a free clinic in the 30s in Harlem and was the first one to show that a lot of these kids, the poverty was leading to big problems and that poor people couldn't get psychiatric help. Even though back then psychiatric help was much different than today and it was all Freudian. But in later years, he became convinced that comic books were the sole cause of juvenile delinquency.
Really?
Yeah, and he wrote a famous book called Seduction of the Innocent. He started becoming famous in the late 40s in Ladies' Home Journal and things like that, which every woman read back then, on how comic books were full of perversion and horrible things that were turning children into monsters. And to look back now, there's been research that he pretty much made up a lot of his conclusions or took things out of context. But he would say, these three little boys in Utah, there was a little girl down the street and they took her in the woods and pulled her pants down. And what he found is that when he talked to them all, they all read comic books. So that's the cause. You know,
Right.
it didn't matter that one of them's father was a convicted sex offender, or one of them had an IQ of 27, or they were just kids doing whatever kids did. It was comic books. And it caused a huge scare, and Wonder Woman was included in that because she was a lesbian.
Right.
And because she dominated Steve Trevor. And it ended up in congressional hearings in
what
1954.
were the hearings about?
Juvenile delinquency.
Okay.
And pretty much how it was comic books were responsible for this supposedly alarming rise in youth sex crimes, which didn't really happen, just that nobody reported them, just as they still don't report them. But he was convinced of that, and in retrospect, it looks like he did it because he knew he had a good thing going. And it pretty much, in later years, destroyed his reputation because he was German. He came over when he was young. He was very well respected, but after that, as the years went on and comics came back, even today he's considered laughable. And when they looked at his notes, which were finally opened at the Library of Congress, they found out that he altered information and altered data and to fit his conclusions. It was really shoddy work. It's funny to read now, Seduction of the Innocent, because it's so ridiculous.
Well, and not only that, I mean, it goes back to the first fallacy or mistake of research, which is that, correlation doesn't equal causation. I mean, just because things happen to co-occur doesn't mean that one caused the other.
Well, it was believed in the early days that it was children.
When you say children, was it for all children or was it mostly boys reading these comic books?
I mean, as far as they know, it was mostly boys. I suspect girls did too. In 1 month, there'd be something like 100 million copies of comic books sold. And now in a month, it's like 50,000 total of all comic books in the whole country because everybody read them. And what they found during World War II is that they were the most popular thing you could send to soldiers. Even more than Life magazine or girly magazines such as they were back then. They wanted comic books. And later on, when crime and horror comic books came along, what research they could do is that these weren't 6-year-old kids reading comics with gory decapitations and zombies. It was adult men reading them, and it really was just men. So by the time Wortham was talking about all this stuff, his research was already 5, 6, 7 years out of date because children had moved on to other things. And aside from those hearings, which killed a lot of comic books, TV came along. That's what killed comic books in the 50s, was TV. Then in the late 40s, the only 3 superheroes left were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Pretty much that was it in the whole comic book world because nobody read superheroes anymore.
Not even Spider-Man?
Spider-Man wasn't created until 1962, I think.
Oh, okay.
Really, from between about 1948 and 1954, those were the 3 comic books, the 3 superheroes, and that was it.
Flash Gordon?
There was Shazam, Captain Marvel went out of business in 1953. Flash Gordon wasn't a comic book.
Oh, okay.
So toward the late 40s, they turned Wonder Woman into sort of a romance character. She was still a hero, but she more often than not was being rescued by Steve Trevor. And she would
longing to marry him,
to make her complete. She needed him. This is after Marsten died and other people took it over. She became a typical late 40s, early 50s comic book woman.
Didn't his wife really resist that?
The changes, yeah. Yeah, because it was completely different. He would have been appalled to see Wonder Woman turned into a simpering romance woman.
And she was a figure in her own right. She was a psychologist as well, as I recall.
She had studied at Harvard as well. That's where they met. I think she'd gone to Radcliffe, maybe.
Yeah.
But she had accomplishments and degrees, as did his partner, who had been a student. And these were people who were associated, as you said, with Margaret Sanger and the women's movement and the right of women to have control over their sexuality and their bodies. I mean, however anyone would have thought about the life of these three individuals, they were doing what they wanted to do. They were consenting adults. And so to turn Wonder Woman into a secretary who can't wait to be chained to a stove.
Yeah, because that's what society said women should be. And Marsten's women were not like that. They were educated. They were not necessarily independent, maybe. Maybe for the time they were.
Well, she worked. Actually, she supported the family.
That's right.
For a long time. The wife, I wish I could remember her name.
I know, we need to look that up.
But she supported the family. And then even his partner, I think her name was Olive.
Yeah.
She was a writer.
Yeah.
And she published in different magazines. I just wanted to note, because we had talked about her a great deal without mentioning her name, Elizabeth Sadie Holloway Marsten. Sadie Holloway was an attorney. She was a psychologist. She was very successful. She was very ambitious. And one of the reasons I remember in the book that she didn't resist Olive coming into the picture, Olive Byrne, who was the niece of Margaret Sanger, coming into the picture was because she wanted her career.
Yes.
And one of the ways to have a career was you need someone at home to raise the children. She wanted children. She had children, but someone had to be home to take care of the household. And she was willing to allow that role to be delegated to Olive. So I think she was also credited with being part of the inspiration for Wonder Woman, but she also helped Marsten develop the lie detector test, which he gets the credit for, but she doesn't. So I think we just want to make mention of her being very successful and very accomplished as a woman in her own right.
Yeah, and she was, and I think Marsten always gave her credit for that. Well, he also hired women to work with him on writing the comic books. The artist who did it for the first 15 years or 12 years, no, it was more like 16 or 17 years, had women working for him because Marsten insisted on it, because he wanted women's point of views and women's roles. But by the 50s, Wonder Woman's stories were just ridiculous. They're really poor. Mm-hmm. The early ones in the 40s are sort of psychedelic in their own way. But the ones later on, she became sort of a secretary romance figure who was always pining for Steve. And then she became sort of science fiction-y, where they introduced Wonder Baby.
Oh.
Who at times was a different character and at times was her as a baby. And there was Wonder Girl, who at times was her sister and at other times was actually her as a young girl. And she had weird villains. She had one villain who was a giant egg, whose name I can't recall. His name was actually Egg Foo, who was a stereotypical Asian character who was a giant egg. And her stories were pretty poor for a long time. And then Marvel came along in the early 60s and started making superheroes popular, but she was always treated sort of as a third-class citizen. They put a lot of effort into Superman and Batman, and Wonder Woman was sort of an afterthought. And then really she hit the bottom in the late 60s, probably around 1970, when it was decided to make her no longer a superhero. So it was said that her people decided to take Paradise Island to another dimension, and if she didn't want to go with them, then she had to give up her powers. So she became just Diana Prince, who went around and solved mysteries and crimes with an elderly blind Asian man who was actually colored yellow in the comics, named I Ching. And she was often being tied up again and had to be rescued. Batman rescued her a few times. There's a famous issue where she is at a women's lib meeting complaining about the women. and how real women want to live with men. And it was pretty embarrassing stuff. And it's hard to read now. And then they went back later in the early 70s, and they took her back to World War II adventures as Wonder Woman. And then she sort of limped along through the 70s. And then in the 80s, she had sort of a renaissance. Some really good writers and artists took her over. And since then, she's had probably 8 or 10 or a dozen different rebirths.
Well, I remember that. I was an avid watcher of that series in the 70s.
Oh, yeah,
although I do remember being confused because there were sort of simultaneously, her being in World War II, set in World War II times, with Steve Trevor, who was also set in World War II, and she was fighting Nazis. And it was, she was the secretary, but she was also Wonder Woman, who was powerful and on occasion saved Steve Trevor. But then simultaneously, there were storylines that were contemporary to the 70s.
That's because the first season, it was on CBS, I believe, and it was supposed to take place during World War II. And it was a little bit campier and had a little animation in it, and it was supposed to be World War II stories. Mm-hmm. Then it was canceled, and it went to ABC, which decided to make it modern. And even though it was still kind of silly, there's no romance between Steve and Wonder Woman. He admires her, she admires him, but I don't believe there's ever any romance between them. Because Linda Carter, who was the perfect Wonder Woman, she was very strong, she was very confident, and it's campy, and it's silly now when you watch it, but what you notice is that Wonder Woman never bows before anybody. She never considers herself less than a man. She's very feminist. She's Wonder Woman, damn it. And she rescues everybody, and she rescues Steve almost every episode. And she's loving and caring, but at the same time, don't mess with her.
Yeah, and that was probably part of the attraction for me as a young girl. But we have this character who's beloved over the years, who at one point was one of 3 major superheroes along with Batman and Superman, and yet it's taken 75 years to get a movie made about her.
I don't think that has anything to do with her so much as with Hollywood, because I can think of maybe you can count on one hand the number of movies made about female superheroes. I can't. There's
less than one hand.
Yeah, because it's just not done.
One Catwoman movie
which was
in
a
the
bomb.
80s, which
the Daredevil girlfriend. What was that?
Elektra. That didn't do well
bomb.
either.
Right, because Marvel has more female characters than DC superheroes.
Yes,
that is true,
and they always have. But I think it was always just believed that men who watch these movies wouldn't see a Wonder Woman movie, and it's turned out that it's a tremendous success, and probably spawned 12 sequels. But,
oh yeah, I mean,
but over history, women have just women's movies were. How many women heroes have there been in movies over the years? Not just superheroes, but even tough detectives or woman who saves the day. The sad thing about Wonder Woman is she's pretty much always been underused, misused as a character, and I don't know if that's just because her comics never sold, or because they put the wrong people on them. In the early 70s, there was a woman editor for about 2 issues who really wanted to make her relevant, and they took the woman off and put a man back on. She's almost always been written and edited by men and drawn by men. The current Wonder Woman is much more like the one in the movies. She's very powerful. She is considered to be as powerful as Superman. She can fly. You really can't kill her. I think in the movie, they make clear that she's immortal. But her message is that she wants peace. She doesn't want to hurt people. But if you are bad and you do bad things and you try to hurt other people, she will be there. She's willing to use her sword. She's willing to use her lasso. And in Batman versus Superman, which was a terrible movie, she was really the bright spot when she came along at the end.
Yes.
And she pretty much saved them in an otherwise bad movie. And I think maybe that's when they realized not only is Gal Gadot a good actress, but this is a character that she can keep up with Superman and Batman. She's as powerful as they are and as smart as they are, if not smarter, because Batman doesn't have any powers at all.
Yeah, some people referred to that Batman versus Superman movie as basically, in some ways, a trailer or inspiration for wanting to see the Wonder Woman movie.
I've been reading Superman comics since 1975. I still remember the first one I ever got when I was 7, and I was so appalled by Batman versus Superman because I can't remember the director's name, Zack Snyder.
Yep.
It's like he'd never read a comic book in his life because Superman and Batman were both so totally different from the comics. And you can't do that with characters that have been around for 75, 80 years. Batman basically now is the same as he was in 1939, and Superman in many ways is the same as he was in 1938. And that's, I think, why people still like them. They're updated, but they stick to their true meanings. And I think Wonder Woman now is back to that, where she's this emissary from another world, from another land. And in the last couple of years of Wonder Woman comics, they show her that she was from this island, Themyscira, and she comes to the land of men because Steve Trevor crashes on the island, and she comes here not knowing how to speak English because she speaks ancient Greek. And she doesn't understand how the world works and how awful it is and war and all that because they didn't have that. In the comics now, she is sort of an alien. She is someone who's not used to this world.
We want to thank Brad for being here. And thank our listeners for listening to us talk about Wonder Woman and the secret life of Wonder Woman.
And if I could just say one more thing, I highly recommend Jill Lepore's book, The Secret Life of Wonder Woman, The Secret History of Wonder Woman, which came out about 3 years ago. And it's in paperback or at the library or on Kindle.
Yeah, I think Dr. Angela and I would second and third that recommendation because we enjoyed that as well.
Yes.
So thank you for having me.
It was great having you here, Brad, and we will have you here again.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Chasing the Mind. Today's episode featured music from purpleplanet.com. Please visit our website at chasingthemind.com, where you can comment on the episode you just heard, and please rate and review this episode on iTunes.